Now, in continuing what was going on in the Western Front, as we know, it was a stalemate, trench warfare. Neither side was going anywhere. They had to think of a way, both sides, the French and the British, the Germans, were trying to think of ways they could break this stalemate. The Germans had come to an invention that they actually invented as far back as 1900, and it was actually called the Flammenwerfer. I like how that sounds, which means flamethrower. And they began by hurling large quantities using either CO2 or things like that, and they hurl humongous amounts of exploding fuel over to the other side about a good 50 feet, and of course burn up their enemy. And which always reminds me of one particular quote of the late George Carlin. I think of this every single time we talk about flamethrowers, where he said, the very existence of flamethrowers proves that somewhere, sometime, somebody said, you know, I'd like to set those people over there on fire, but I'm just not close enough to get the job done, which is exactly what it was. So the Germans would, in 1915 in the Flanders region, they went against the Toms, the British. That brings us to that. Toms. That is a nickname for British soldiers as far back as 1743. There's a lot of debate as to what actually was the origin of that, but British soldiers were called Toms. And the counterparts, they began referring to the Germans as Jerrys. Tom and Jerry, yes, the cartoon. What happened there was, it wasn't actually big until the Second World War, but in the First World War is where it first got started. They called each other Tom and Jerry for those reasons. Now, moving back to the flamethrower, they go across into no man's land, and they would have this exploding tank of gas on their back, and they would wind up going to the British or French lines, and they would light up the whole area. And needless to say, the French and the British were freaking out. They didn't know what this was. And so initially it did a great deal of damage to the French and the British. But after the initial shock wore off and the French and the British became savvy to what the Germans were doing, it actually became quite hazardous to be someone who did flamethrower. Because as soon as the French and the British had any indication that there was a flamethrower in the area, they would immediately put every single gun and rifle they had on that spot. And when they heard the pfft and knowing that the flamethrower went up in smoke, that's when I knew it was safe. And plus, they were not very nice when they actually did capture soldiers who were flamethrowers for the obvious reasons of that. So the Hague Convention, which was the treaty on how to treat soldiers, the convention before the Geneva Convention, it was the Hague Convention, it really didn't apply, because if you were a flamethrower officer and you were caught, you could count on not going home. So there you go.